So I am pleased to be joined by Professor Stephen F. Cohen of NYU and Princeton. Professor Cohen and I last discussed the prevailing Russia controversies in February, and unsurprisingly, Russia has remained at the center of American political discourse since then, and the focus on it has only intensified. Therefore, I view it as an imperative to consult with Professor Cohen regularly on this topic. And I guess I would just begin by asking you to reflect more broadly on what it means that Russia has been such a focal point of American political dialogue now for such an extended period of time. It's become so thoroughly embedded in the public consciousness in a way that we haven't seen in decades, I think. So, how do you interpret that event from sort of a longer term perspective?
Well, let me first of all applaud you, because when we spoke, what was it, 4 or 5 months ago, you were very much aware and were reporting how this Russia story is being driven inside the United States by politics, including politics in the Democratic Party. So I don't think either of us are surprised that 4 or 5 months later, the role that Russia's playing in our domestic politics is even greater. I have in mind what people call Russiagate, the allegation that the Russians somehow intervened in the 2016 election to Trump's benefit. Let me tell you what really smart, they're not anti-American Russians who study international affairs for a living, how they would answer your question. They think we've gone crazy. Literally, they don't understand this. They understand it intellectually when they think about it, but it's so the bashing, that Russophobia, the allegations that Russia hijacked our election seems so far-fetched to them that they think something's gone wrong with us. By the way, Russian President Putin, it was either in his interview with Oliver Stone, shown last week on Showtime, or in another interview, maybe with Figaro, because he's always asked about this, said something to the effect, somebody has to get him an anti-hysteria pill in America. Something's gone wrong with the Americans. And I kind of see that, but on the other hand, this is partly a hangover of the old Cold War. I mean, we have been through it before, but nothing like this or as dangerous. Let me just briefly, and then I'll stop, summarize where I think we are. I said it to you months ago, but it's gotten worse. In a quick summary, bullets. We're in a new Cold War with Russia that is much more dangerous than the preceding Cold War for various reasons. One is that there are at least 3 Cold War fronts that are fraught with hot war. That would be Ukraine, that would be the Baltic Black Sea region, where NATO is undertaking an unprecedented military buildup on Russia's borders, and of course in Syria, where American and Russian aircraft are flying in the same airspace. And I would add to that, those 3 Cold War fronts, what is now called Russiagate, because the accusation that Trump needs to be impeached because he's somehow a Russian agent so distorts and cripples the possibility of the White House making Russia policy that I think it's a Cold War front. I thought from the beginning, when I began saying this, and this was actually in 2014, when the civil and then proxy war broke out in Ukraine on Russia's borders, that the danger of a new Cuban Missile Crisis was really possible, something just that existential. And it's possible that this week, Michael, I don't want to exaggerate, but that the shoot down of the Syrian warplane, in Syria, of course, near Raqqa, by, I guess, an American warplane, and the Russian reaction, threat to retaliate, kind of adumbrates or approaches a Cuban Missile Crisis, with both nuclear powers, in effect, threatening each other with retaliation if one doesn't back down. So I don't want to say we're in a Cuban Missile Crisis, but that kind of danger that's now inherent in this new Cold War, we can see it. I didn't make it up. Excuse me. And the final point I would make is that we think back to what John F. Kennedy, the way he was able to bargain and compromise and negotiate with Soviet leader Khrushchev in the early 60s, because Kennedy was trusted. He wasn't accused of being an agent of the Kremlin. Trump has no such flexibility. If a compromise is necessary to the Kremlin to prevent nuclear war, I'm not sure Trump is in a position to make it. So you ask the rhetorical question, is the only way Trump can prove that he's loyal to America is the only way to go to nuclear war with Russia. Now that seems preposterous, but it's no more preposterous than this thing we call Russiagate.
So we will touch on the latest Syria news in a bit, but again, just because this issue has been so central to the American public consciousness, I think it's important to talk about it from a more bird's eye perspective on occasion. And something that I observed a few weeks ago now, or last month, and I told you about this, was in Montana, where I was covering a special election campaign. You could see evidence that the embeddedness of this issue in the political consciousness, especially of Democrats, is becoming exceptionally heightened, to the point that Rob Quist, the defeated Democratic nominee in this special House race last month, he took to one of the public debates with his Republican rival, Greg Gianforte, who later famously body slammed a reporter. Quist got on television and said of Gianforte, quote, "He'll bet on Russia, I'll bet on Montana." So this was a populist Democrat, somebody who was at least portrayed as being a sharp break from the status quo in the party. And even for him, it was seen as somehow politically advantageous to go down this rabbit hole. And this is in Montana in a special election where most people are concerned about, land usage and other sort of parochial concerns, and yet the Russia furor infected even a race this remote. And I'm just wondering how you react to that.
Well, I react very, very badly. And I wouldn't single out that guy. I mean, the people that some of us have looked to in high places over the years in the Democratic Party have become Russophobic, Russia bashers, wild Cold Warriors all over this Trump situation. I mean, it distresses me, for example, I don't know if it's fair to single out people, but that Sherrod Brown, who I believe I first met when he was a Russian studies minor at Yale University and came to see me many, many years ago, and whose career I've admired and followed, is a leading co-sponsor of these sanctions against Russia in the Senate, which are ignorant, they'll be destructive to the United States, and they will make everything worse. So you can make a list of Democrats that I, at least, and me being considerably older than you, but you in more recent times have thought were sensible people. They've just lost it on this. Now, how we explain it, I'm not sure. I mean, some people go back to Richard Hofstadter's famous book, The Paranoid, what was it called, Impulse in American History, that these kinds of witch hunts are redolent. And you could say that there was a lot of this in the preceding Cold War, but when I entered public life or began to use my professorial perch at Princeton to comment publicly on Russian-American relations during, that Cold War, there was some of this, but nothing like this. And I remember vividly that when the debate between the so-called pro-détente group, of which I was one, and the more Cold War, build more nuclear weapons group, which opposed us, both of us had influential allies everywhere in the media, in Congress, even in the White House, aides to the presidents, State Department. We always had allies. That's not the case today. It's one hand clapping, and it appears apart from Senator McCain, of course, who seems to really have traveled off the reservation, that the leading voices are Democratic. You got to remember where these people get information to the extent they have information. I looked at the people who formulated this Senate resolution, the new sanctions, and what they said these sanctions would accomplish. So far as I can tell, not one of them knows anything about Russia whatsoever, anything about the history of American-Russian relations. What they're hearing, primarily, is what's coming primarily, but not only, from the defeated Clinton campaign, which is she won the election, but Putin stole it from her for Trump. And that a lot of Democrats have apparently convinced themselves that they can take back the House in 2018 playing this Russiagate card. I think it's a mistake, morally, politically, but also electorally. But they're certainly committed to it, and they're running a lot of events locally, where you were, Michael, in different states, which focus on this Russiagate. Let me end by reading you one thing. You probably saw it. Past Sunday, the New York Times, and, bear in mind that a lot of quasi-educated members of Congress, especially Democrats, rely on the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I guess MSNBC for their information. Here's what the New York Times wrote on Sunday in its warmongering, pro-Cold War assault on both Russia and Trump. I'll just read you one brief paragraph. Under direct orders from President Vladimir Putin, hackers connected to Russian military intelligence broke into the email accounts of senior officials at the Democratic National Committee and of Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, John Podesta. They passed thousands of emails, tens of thousands of emails, to the website WikiLeaks, which posted them throughout the last months of the campaign in an attempt to damage the Clinton campaign. Michael, if you followed serious people who have examined this allegation of hacking, there is not one shred of evidence for a word of what the Times wrote. What makes this shocking, and I used to rely on the New York Times, for coverage, is that this is based entirely on two things. The so-called Three Intelligence Agency report that was published in January 2017, which literally said Putin had personally directed the hacking. I mean,
it's just, in other words, it's just a regurgitation of an official government claim that hasn't come anywhere close to being independently substantiated.
Well, it's worse than that, though, Michael, because you and I, not only because it's what we do, critical analysis of the world, history, and politics, but because we're in search of facts and logical reasoning. This Times article disregards maybe a score of serious expert opinion that have utterly destroyed that so-called intelligence report. In other words, it doesn't matter to the Times any longer. They don't publish it in the Times, of course. And then they add on, and this is really alarming. You remember when Comey testified to the House, or wherever he testified a few weeks ago, he turned into J. Edgar Hoover, who was always preaching my generation that there was a communist under every bed. Hoover then being FBI director, in case your younger folks don't remember J. Edgar. And Comey said that the Russians had done all this and ended by saying, they will be back. They will be back. In other words, the kind of scaremongering that drove the first Cold War to its excesses. So the Times takes a now discredited so-called intelligence report of January 2017, tacks on Comey's madness, because Comey knows nothing about Russia. Every time he was asked a question about Russia during his testimony, he made a factual mistake. I mean, somebody's just giving him talking points. For God's sake, somebody asked him about the role of Gazprom, which is this enormous Russian gas company that is said to be a large part of Putin's power in the world. And Comey said he'd never heard of Gazprom, never heard of it. The director of the FBI, who's lecturing us on Russian motives. And then the congresswoman explained to him Well, it's an oil company. No, it's not an oil company. The word gaz, G-A-Z, obviously is gas. It's a gas company, a natural gas company. So the blind and the ignorant, talking to the blind and the ignorant in Congress, may be the most, and then the Times repeating it as its lead editorial, that may be the most discouraging aspect of all of this.
And that New York Times editorial, I think it's worth emphasizing just how incendiary it really was. I mean, it asserted that Vladimir Putin, the head of this country that the New York Times is supposedly so disturbed about antagonizing, that Putin, quote, launched an attack on our democracy directly, personally. So he personally orchestrated this attack. And it's amazing because there is claim stacked upon claim in this editorial that just simply lacks sufficient evidentiary basis. I mean, that's what's so incredible now, approaching almost a year of this furor. It's that the evidentiary record remains so scant. And yet you have the New York Times fashioning this very streamlined version of the Russian narrative story in the form of this editorial, and people don't question it anymore. I mean, it's just become taken as a given that evidence isn't particularly necessary anymore, or maybe that evidence actually has been produced in the form of these anonymous whisperings from factions of the intelligence community and this report from January that you referenced.
Right.
And even this claim that 17 intelligence agencies all agree that Russia, quote unquote, interfered. That is also a sort of a canard that just gets endlessly repeated and eventually gets ingrained in the population who believe what people in positions of authority say.
Well, I mean, I don't know why we have to be so reserved and call it a canard when it comes to influential institutions like the New York Times. It's not a canard, it's a lie. They said it was 17 intelligence agencies. Now, I don't know anybody who can name the 17 American intelligence agencies, though I know it includes the Coast Guard, which I assume was really on the Russian case. But we've been told since, publicly, by Clapper, the former, what was he called? He was sort of head of defense intelligence. He was the overseer. And Brennan, the head of the CIA, that it was not 17. It never was. It was 3. The CIA, the FBI, and the National Security Agency. Remember when they published that so-called report, the NSA, the National Security Agency, said it was not highly confident, whereas the other two, the FBI and the CIA, said they were highly confident in the report. Well, the NSA is the only agency that can actually tell us who took the emails out of, because they have the capacity, as we know from Snowden, to be in our computers. That's what they do. And if they had the capacity to be in the computers and see emails moving around from the DNC, Russia, and elsewhere, and they weren't highly confident, they were, quote, moderately confident, and that means they don't know, the whole thing was bogus from the beginning. The Times disregards daily information. For example, in the indictment of Russia that you just mentioned, they say that the Russians hacked the French election. But the French cybersecurity chief issued a statement about 4 days ago, before this Times editorial, saying that the cybersecurity authorities of France found no such evidence whatsoever. So the Times is either not paying attention to the news of the world, or it's deleting inconvenient facts, or it's flat out lying. And that's not the only example of where they commit a misstatement of fact, even though you would think it would be known to the New York Times. So something terribly bad has gone wrong, Michael.
Yeah, you talk about the people that Democrats and others rely on for information on this subject. And I think it's worth calling attention to a comment that James Clapper made recently on Meet the Press. James Clapper was speaking of Russians, and Clapper said, quote, typically that they are almost genetically driven to co-opt, penetrate, and gain favor. So that's James Clapper, the person who is sought after as an authority on these issues, demonstrating that his mindset is one of attributing inborn qualities to Russians that make them somehow inherently disposed to carry out spycraft or subterfuge or what have you. And you have to assume that the mindset that Clapper exemplified there is shared within elements of the intelligence community, which he essentially headed. And it's this intelligence community who are behind many of the anti-Russia leaks that we've been seeing, and which are then seized upon by Democrats as the unadulterated truth. And there's so little skepticism of motive that's applied, and so little cognizance that people who might have a pre-existing commitment to a hostile posture toward Russia are overseeing this campaign on the part of Democrats who really ought to know better, you would hope.
So let me play poker with you and call you and tell you things are even worse, but then step back a bit. What Clapper said about Russians, that they're genetically disposed to do us in and be evildoers, is of course a form, I guess, of racism. I mean, like saying, Jews are genetically disposed to cheat you financially, and blacks are this, and the Irish are that. This is something that we wouldn't tolerate. And nobody protested. I think he said it on NBC or someplace.
He said it on Meet the Press. So he said it on the
Press.
Flagship television show that the establishment kind of organized themselves around.
And by the way, he had said it in Australia 2 days before. That's where I first heard him say it. So it wasn't an accident. But let's step back a minute. And you're right. Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think that there has been an intelligence operation run against Trump surreptitiously, going back at least since early 2016. And that I would call it Intelgate. And it's that, not Russiagate, that really rivals Watergate and needs to be investigated. What these intelligence services have been doing, in addition to breaking the law, with this pattern of secret surveillance and leaking to the press for months and months. So you're right. Who are these people that have sat, I guess, through most of the Obama administration and only now departed, and who have run our intelligence services? So we know that Clapper is a Russophobe. He thinks that they are genetically evil people. But look what Brennan said in his testimony. He was the director of the CIA. He said something absolutely astonishing, but it's good we now know it. He said, and I can't quote him exactly, but I do not misparaphrase him. He said that Americans who have contacts with Russians have a risk of heading down a treasonous path that they are not aware of until they commit treason. Stop and think about that. This is a guy who was downright paranoid about unofficial contacts with Russia. Now, he might have told me 50 years ago when I started my career, because I've had, scores, hundreds of contacts with Russians over my life of all kind. That's what I do. I try to make contact with knowledgeable Russians, and sometimes just with Russians who are a lot of fun. But imagine saying that. That was the director of the CIA. And then we have Comey's astonishing testimony where he comes forward and says he's a great authority on Russia, and he knows they hacked this, he knows they'll be back. But then he admits he's been one of the leakers. So we have these three top intelligence guys essentially outing themselves. And the strange thing is, nobody pays a mind to what they said, except to a certain extent, Comey's leaking. But that was okay because it was against Trump. But my back away is this, is that when I was teaching at Princeton, I had a number of very, very good students at the undergraduate or master's level, and even a couple at the PhD level, who didn't want to be academics. They wanted to go to work for the CIA because they didn't want to kill anybody or spy on anybody, but the CIA had a unit on Russia, and it may still have it, though who knows. They did nothing but research. These young people, if they got the job, sat in the CIA in Langley or someplace, doing exactly what I did, studying like scholars, Russia, but they had some declassified material. And back in those days, occasionally, I would actually be invited to join one of their seminars, and we have a discussion. I wrote an article once that they adopted as a kind of test model about reformers and conservatives in the Soviet political elite. So these people in the agency were good people, intelligent people. They could have been professors at American universities. which reminds us, the intelligence services are highly factionalized. There's no the intelligence, no the FBI, the CIA. There are rival factions at the top in there, warring with each other, and they have been throughout my lifetime. One of them, for example, sold President Kennedy on the Bay of Pigs adventure, which was a disaster, while another warned against it. I think what we've been seeing for the last year is an element, but a powerful element, at the top of the agencies, particularly the FBI and the CIA, less so the national security agencies, waging a kind of surreptitious campaign against Trump and his, quote, associates, and leaking. But I wouldn't say that all these agencies are tainted by this behavior. I think this is just was a leadership group. Now they're out, but some of their adherents evidently are still there because the leaks continue.
Let me just read to you that quote from Brennan that you referenced, because I have the exact wording here, and it really is sort of chilling to know that.
But chilled me, because that's what I do.
Right. He said, quote, frequently, and this was in May, quote, frequently people who go along a treasonous path do not know they are on a treasonous path until it is too late. So apparently going down a treasonous path entails simply speaking with people of Russian nationality and gathering information, doing what academics and journalists and so many others have done for years. And yet that behavior is now being treated as somehow intrinsically suspicious. And one of the pernicious effects of all this has been that Democrats have valorized factions within the intelligence services that are leaking this information because it maybe does some short-term political damage on Trump. But they don't look past the short-term political implications and see that, instilling this mindset and heralding it as virtuous is really going to entrench some pretty pernicious behavior. But Democrats are so kind of blinkered by the centrality of Trump to everything that they do or say that they can't sort of see the forest for the trees, to use a cliche.
Well, think about the fallout. What's the impact of Brennan's statement on young American scholars who are maybe in their late 20s, maybe early 30s, beginning careers that involve going to Russia and using the archives and living among Russians and having discussions with Russian colleagues in political science or history, when they're being told by Brennan that these kind of contacts with Russians can lead, and when you don't even know it, to treason? I mean, I resent it, but I laugh at it because it's a kind of deranged Saturday Night Live anecdote that for 50 years I've been on a road to treason with all my Russian contacts, and it's certainly taken me a long time to get to actual treason itself, because in 50 years I'm unaware of having committed any treason, although, let me confess to you, I have known quite a few Russian intelligence officers in my life. Some of them are very, very good historians, by the way, because the old KGB and the current Russian security forces have a historical academy where they study some of the topics like Stalin's terror that I study, and it's good to have discussions with them. They know things I don't know. But, I mean, it's a chilling. And then flash forward, if I'm right, that a Cuban Missile Crisis type of crisis may be coming, maybe in Syria. How will our policy class and our White House react if it's now assumed that any contacts with Russia may have made Americans treasonous? When the crisis is resolved, I want American specialists who've had a lot of contact with Russia helping the White House and the State Department and the President making decisions. Are these people now all stigmatized? I mean, it's not a joke. I mean, it's funny on the one hand. It's a sick joke on the one hand, but it's exceedingly dangerous.
It is a sick joke on the one hand, but you have to take it extremely seriously because, by my observations, there are huge swaths now of the Democratic Party coalition, good, well-intentioned people largely, who have taken in this narrative hook, line, and sinker, and now would see maybe even traveling to Russia as somehow cause for suspicion, and that's going to again have long-lasting consequences in terms of just basic bilateral relations.
Well, look, I mean, this is spread. It's not just a handful of officials saying these things. Chris Matthews. I don't watch MSNBC very much because I know what they're doing, something that's very bad for the nation on this Russiagate story, but they're out to impeach Trump and they think that's how to do it. But Chris Matthews, a grown and serious man with a lot of political experience, actually said on his broadcast to somebody, real Americans don't go to Russia, they go to Paris. I mean, what kind of thing is that to say, real Americans don't go to Russia? Incidentally, to keep our minds, there are, I don't know the exact number, but surely hundreds of American corporations and business firms that have been operating in Russia since the 1990s and are still there. Procter & Gamble, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Wendy's, McDonald's, I mean, all sorts of. Ford was there big time until recently. Did these people head down a treasonous path? You remember during the so-called reset under Obama, which was badly designed and inevitably failed, but part of it was Obama publicly saying that American businesses should go to Russia, follow a Russian path to profit. What was Obama, a secret Russian agent then, pointing toward treason? This has all become beyond preposterous. It's just existentially dangerous to all of us, and I can't see where it's going to end. Though again, considering what's been happening in Syria, and let's make the point, that American aircraft shooting down that Syrian plane crossed a Russian red line. Putin is saying, Moscow is saying that it may now put all Syrian war assets under Russian protection in Syria. Russia has something called the SS-400. It can shoot down anything across Syria. In effect, if Putin makes this official, he's declared a no-fly zone in Syria. If we challenge it, he won't back down. American planes will get shot down. That will be the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then we pray.
Right. Barack Obama established this so-called deconfliction line that would be used to minimize the potential for some kind of inadvertent clash in Syria between Russian and American forces. For some reason, Obama wasn't denounced as a Russian stooge or pawn when he sought to foster military cooperation with them in 2015. But somehow whenever that accusation gets leveled at Trump, it seems to include his apparent unwillingness to engage in direct hostilities in Syria.
Well, let's connect a dot here, because if you'd gone 1 year later in Obama's presidency, we would have an enticing clue. In September, you'll remember this, Michael, 2016, through long negotiations between American Secretary of State Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, with Putin personally participating in Moscow when Kerry came, Obama and Putin agreed on military cooperation in Syria. This was in September 2016, against the Islamic State and other terrorist groups. The deal was that there would be a 7-day testing period before that agreement went into effect, that nobody would violate the general terms. And during that period, American warplanes attacked a Syrian troop camp and killed 80 Syrian soldiers, a clear violation of the agreement. And the agreement was ended. It was clearly sabotaged by our Department of Defense. They said it was an accident, but no serious person believed it. So if the Department of Defense was sabotaging even Obama's meager efforts to cooperate in Syria with Russia, imagine what these agencies, Department of Defense and Intelligence, have been doing when they heard about Trump's campaign slogan, "It would be great to cooperate with Russia," first and foremost in Syria. So now we get this episode at the beginning of this week that suddenly an American airplane shoots down a Syrian aircraft. Was that sabotage? I think it was. And the reason is that though we haven't been told, there have been a number of reports in the newspapers that in fact, beyond deconfliction, which as you say is that The Russians tell the Americans when and where they're going to fly in Syria, and we do the same so we don't shoot each other down. There seems to have been some active cooperation in some military actions beyond deconfliction. That is, under Trump, some actual military or intelligence cooperation was going on with Russia in Syria. Evidently, powerful forces in Washington do not like this, and I would interpret the shoot down of that Syrian aircraft as another act of sabotage, just like they did to Obama in September 2016. So I think that, to some point, we don't want to be paranoid, and I've never been a conspiracy theorist, but this is evidence. This is actual evidence. I don't know that you'll read a word about it in the New York Times, but the Russians have gone crazy about this. They see it as a provocation, a breaking of the American word, and there is tremendous pressure on Putin. I mean, there is a politics in Russia, Michael. Tremendous pressure on Putin to, quote, be tough in his response. So where does this lead now?
I think what is certain, we don't know exactly the circumstances of this shoot down yet, and your speculation may well prove accurate. But I think what we know to be certain, and what is frequently denied, especially by Democrats and liberal media figures in the United States, is that the domestic climate around Russia informs what goes on the battlefield in a place like Syria. It shows that whatever deconfliction or coordination might exist between the U.S. and Russia in Syria is crucial to maintaining some semblance of stability there, and preventing some kind of escalation of hostilities that might theoretically result in some kind of nuclear confrontation. That's the worst case scenario, and everything you would think should be done to avoid that scenario. And yet, Democrats don't seem willing often to acknowledge the connection between the furor that they whipped up domestically, which creates a certain set of incentives that militate in a certain way on Trump, which is toward greater belligerence toward Russia in Syria. I mean, Democrats seem kind of chronically unwilling to acknowledge that there's any kind of connection there. But of course, domestic politics always informs foreign policy and has throughout history, and there are so many other contexts that we could name right now, which it wouldn't even be controversial to postulate that connection. And yet now there's this just the unabiding reluctance to say that yes, this kind of hysteria that we've engendered does have an effect on how we carry out foreign policy initiatives.
Well, you should have been a professor. It's an axiom of the academic study of international relations that domestic factors play a huge role on the making of foreign policy. So you just got a PhD. No, there are a lot of dissertations written on this, and you're absolutely right. On the other hand, and this is generational.
By the way, I wrote papers on just that dynamic myself with regard to Vietnam, and it wasn't seen as controversial. But today, you couldn't utter those words in certain circles.
It's very hard to get it out. But, here there's a kind of generational and autobiographical divergence between you and me. I grew up in the Jim Crow South in Kentucky, where American apartheid segregation was complete. The South at that time was a one-party South. It was a Democratic Party South, and the Democratic Party was segregationist. So, I remember the Democratic Party in its different configurations and manifestations during my fairly long lifetime. But I also remember that when Johnson, for whatever reasons, began to escalate the war in Vietnam, that it was only a handful of members of Congress that protested. Because remember, it was not a popular position to challenge Johnson or the war. It was in the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination. And those men who did this were equally Republicans and Democrats. They were heroes. And it wasn't just Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. They came later, but right at the beginning, at the Gulf of Tonkin, that provocation that escalated the war. So there was a time when we didn't have to be a Republican or a Democrat to hope that men and women of courage and insight would step forward and provide an alternative point of view in the Congress, and that would seep into the media. Their voices would spread. There was no internet then, but there was television and op-ed pages and radio. That does not exist today. In the mainstream, we could point to Rand Paul as apparently a dissenting voice, to Tulsi Gabbard in the House, maybe one or two others. But this is different. And you got to say that some of the protesters were Republicans back then during Vietnam. But the Democratic Party is worse than a disappointment. It's become part of the problem in terms of war and peace. And I mean, Bernie Sanders, his campaign was remarkable. And all we old people like to see an old guy make a run. And all the old guys are going to run. I mean, everybody who's 70 is going to run again, by the way. Clinton obviously wants to run again. Sanders plans on running again. Biden set up some kind of organization so he can run again. Trump will try to run again. He's in his 70s. When Kennedy was elected, we thought nobody over 50 can run for the presidency. Now, if you're younger than 70, you're disqualified. So get out of the way, Michael. I may run for president. And you guys, you young kids, just get out of the way. We geriatrics will handle things. The tragedy is that age did not bring these people any wisdom. Sanders was not good. He said things like, I'm not a fan of regime change. I mean, what kind of that talk is that for a presidential candidate? Spell it out. Spell it out. She, of course, Mrs. Clinton, was essentially a Cold War monger throughout the campaign about Russia, and the rest remained silent. So I don't know if this is a matter of party any longer. The Republicans are completely disoriented and paralyzed by Trump. They don't know what to do with him. And the Democrats think that everything's now about Trump, and they're going to get control of Congress by bashing Trump and linking him to Putin. So, what can we say other than if there's a real crisis, we are in deep trouble?
Well, there appears to be almost a total conformity of opinion within the Democratic Party on this issue, and that was best demonstrated last week by this vote on sanctions, which for some reason the Senate decided to combine the prospective sanctions on Iran with sanctions on Russia in the same bill. And the two senators who voted against final passage of that bill were Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders, although Bernie Sanders was very quick to clarify that he had no objection to the Russia element of the bill. So he was ideologically aligned with the vast majority of the caucus on that subject. And it just occurs to me that we've seen what this stifling effect that this conformity of opinion can have in the past, and yet people are just kind of sleepwalking into this days now where they don't challenge assumptions anymore. That's resulting in policy that seems ill-considered. Like whenever somebody tries to justify why sanctions on Russia are warranted, they seem almost invariably to refer to the quote message that it would send or some kind of symbolic utility, rather than any kind of practical argument for how would imposing these sanctions have any meaningful impact on whatever goals it is we're trying to advance in practical, tangible terms. Instead, they repair to the symbolism argument that just seems grounded on very little to me.
Well, it's even worse than that because they don't ask what the negative consequences are. So let me report something that's unfolding as we talk. I think probably later in the week, the Washington Post or the New York Times might get around to reporting it, but I'm not sure. These sanctions are so unwise. First of all, they will have no impact on Russian policymaking. Zero. It'll make things a little harder for Russia, but Russia's learned to live under the sanctions. One result being, is this ever reported, that Russia has become the world's largest exporter of agricultural produce now. Because they were cut off from their European suppliers, they invested a lot of money in agriculture 3 years ago. And now they are the world's largest exporter of agricultural produce, and some Russians say that if they keep this up, that agricultural revenue earned abroad will exceed that of Russian natural gas, which would be sensational for Russia, very, very good. So the Russians will go on, but what's not noted is that Europe's in rebellion against these sanctions that the Senate published in the past. They haven't been passed yet. The House has to sign off, and Trump would have to sign it, but he doesn't. He can't. He can't veto it. There's too many votes in Congress. But what are the consequences? You have got the Prime Minister of Austria, the Prime Minister of Germany, Merkel herself, and France denouncing these Senate sanctions because they impact on a natural gas line being built in Europe on which these countries are dependent. It ships natural gas from Russia. Russia provides about a third of the European Union's energy, mainly some oil, mainly natural gas. So these senators, in their infinite ignorance, wrote the sanctions in a way that they impact on investment in a vital natural gas line. So Europe is protesting, and by the way, these are NATO countries. These are the allies that we claim Putin is trying to steal from us. This is a rupture in the so-called transatlantic alliance that has been caused by these senators who know nothing, are simply like sending smoke signals in the sky to somebody they imagine is out there without ever studying or understanding the consequences of this. And so when Merkel said, what was a couple of weeks ago, that because of Trump, Europe might now have to go its own way in its national security, which I think would be a very, very good thing. Europe is very large and powerful and rich, and it should have its own foreign policy. But you can no longer blame it on Trump. It's the anti-Trump people that are now alienating Europe. And what's going to happen now? Two foreign ministers in Europe said that Europe would level its own sanctions against the United States if these sanctions passed Congress. Can you imagine? So this is where demented, mad, crazed anti-Russianism, driven by Trump and this so-called Russiagate, is leading American foreign policy to alienating its own traditional allies. And of course, where will they go? They will go back to Russia, which has gone to China. It's all shifted, Michael.
And what worries me and what I view on a regular basis now is that it's seen by Democrats as mollifying their most vocal constituents if they take this kind of tack against Russia. So they view it now as a so-called progressive agenda item to push the sanctions agenda and to keep the heat up on this Russia topic. So they're sort of getting a certain level of legitimacy now that's flowing upwards from the grassroots, who have been so inundated for a year straight with this kind of frenetic Russia talk. So you're creating almost a feedback loop. And I always try to be cognizant of incentives, and the incentive structure now that are operative are truly worrisome. And it seems like it's only going to get worse.
Well, the calculation has been made, I think, from what I read, see, and hear, certainly by the Clinton wing of the party, but the other wing has kind of given in on this issue, that bashing Russia is a winning electoral ticket in 2018. So that proof will be in that pudding. And a lot will happen between now and then, and a lot will depend on whether Trump completely screws up the domestic agenda and the Democrats win anyway. But, I think there's going to be a backlash in favor of Trump at some point. I guess Democrats running in local races need to sign on to this Russia bashing as an electoral ploy. Where I hail from, to the extent that I still talk to people down in Kentucky, I ended up on Fox TV, news cable, a couple times this year. So they saw me, they watched Fox down there, and they were baffled. And their reaction is, what the heck is going on? What's this all about? I mean, questioning. But you've got a kill the messenger phenomenon, Michael, too. I mean, I don't know if you or your viewers saw all or part of Oliver Stone's 4 hours of interviews with Putin that was shown on Showtime last week. It's the first time that Americans have ever had a chance to encounter Putin directly. I mean, Stone's camera's in his face. Putin talks and talks about everything. So you can judge for yourself if this is somebody we should be afraid of. But before it was even shown, the media war against Stone for even having made the documentary. How dare he go to Russia and give Putin 4 hours to talk to the American people? It didn't surprise me, but it's really ugly. I mean, they demonized Stone, tried to kill the messenger, so nobody would either watch or be misled by Putin, as though Americans are zombies and we need to be told what to think about what Putin or Russia might say. That's not good form. I mean, that's not the way we used to do it in this country. I had hoped that there would be a major discussion in the aftermath of this broadcast about the Putin who appeared for 4 hours. Is this the person we've demonized? Was Trump right in saying he wanted to cooperate with Putin, or was Trump wrong? That we'd have some rational discourse. But instead, because there was no evidence that any of these people had actually watched the documentary, let's just assassinate Oliver Stone. Let's completely discredit him, and then we don't have to listen to Putin.
Right, and what people said was, they denounced...
And that's going to happen to you with this stuff, too. I mean, to the extent that your broadcasts reach beyond an open-minded constituency, you will be denounced, and I will be denounced as some kind of benefactors of the Kremlin, I guess.
Yeah, the denunciations are pretty frequent in my case, so I become inured to it. But one of the reasons why people were so upset that Oliver Stone conducted and broadcast these interviews is because they felt that he was trying to portray Putin in a positive light, and then by extension that meant he was trying to portray Trump in a positive light, which is suggestive of this tendency now to view Trump and Putin as sort of like a peas in the pod, or that their interests are totally aligned, or that they're sort of almost synonymous with one another in the public imagination, at least the American public imagination. That's sort of destructive in its own right, and it's hard to know what to do to disabuse people of that perception, given just the daily deluge of kind of distorted information that they're being subjected to.
Well, when Paul Krugman, and not only Paul Krugman, among New York Times columnists, writes repeatedly of the Trump-Putin axis in the White House, that, words have consequences. Russians like to say, slovo to delo, words are also deeds. Krugman has a lot of influence, particularly among liberals and progressives. I mean, there's no evidence he knows anything about Russia whatsoever. We were colleagues, I think, for a while at Princeton in the economics department. I never heard him as somebody said to know anything about Russia, but he writes that, the Trump-Putin axis in the White House. So they become hyphenated. And this Russiagate, again, for which I think there is absolutely no evidence. If anything's possible in this world, I'd be happy to look at evidence if it's ever produced. But when you go around saying over and over and over and over again, Trump, Putin, Putin, Trump, Trump, Putin, you think it's one person. And the discourse consequences and then the policy consequences of that, I've already tried to emphasize to you. I can simply say that I've never seen anything like it in American public life in the years that I've paid attention, and it's been quite a few decades. Never seen anything like it. Even I showed up when the McCarthy era was over, but I saw the consequences of that, the impact. But this is just worse in all ways.
And I think what this stems from, and I've mentioned this before, is that when Democrats and liberals elevate Trump as a persona, as a figure, to this kind of singular role in their consciousness or in their political agenda, then all else is going to get subordinated to their ultimate goal of weakening and removing Trump. And because they view this Russia matter as a vehicle by which Trump can be weakened and potentially removed from power, they're all in on it and they're deeply invested in it. And that's because they can't look beyond just their aversion to Trump, for all his vulgarity and for all the legitimate reasons to oppose Trump. I mean, he is not the sole factor in geopolitics,
No.
and there are other things that ought to be taken into consideration. But people have such a myopic view of the situation now, that they can't see beyond whatever works in the short term to stymie Trump in some way.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So I think we should leave it there.
All right. Take care, man.